Good morning, everyone. Lawyers tend to get the most challenging slots just before lunch. We'll try to keep it reasonably interesting. This session will be slightly different from the previous sessions. This session deals with what happens when things break down, when there are disputes, when we actually have to resolve a difference of opinion or a disagreement, and how effectively and how quickly and how cost effectively you deal with that is important in maintaining the relationship between the parties, in getting a good solution for both parties. And typically, people are familiar with using litigation, which is using a third-party court system establishment to resolve issues. But here we are going to talk about an alternative dispute resolution approach, which is probably more efficient, especially for our industry, than going through the courts, which is expensive, unpredictable, and takes a long time. So today, I'm Paul Ng from Rajah and Tann. I head the aviation practice there. It's a regional law firm with about 1,000 lawyers across Southeast Asia and China. And my colleague here, Shaun Leong from HFW, is also a specialist in ADR. We both are from the Singapore International Mediation Center, a very successful center that has championed the Singapore Convention, which is a convention that tries to mimic arguably the most successful treaty in the world, which is the New York Convention for arbitration. The Singapore Convention is for mediation, that makes mediation agreements binding across the Singapore Convention world, or the treaty countries. So actually, without further ado, maybe I'll hand it across to Shaun to explain a little bit to you what is mediation, this alternative dispute resolution, which may be more suitable for the aviation industry.
Thanks a lot, Paul. So I just want to use today's opportunity to highlight a few key important aspects on mediation as a process. The first thing to note is that mediation is probably the only last opportunity for parties to achieve a self-determined outcome. Because if you fight out your dispute in the courts, if you fight out your disputes before an arbitral tribunal, you actually hand the reins of control to a judge, to a tribunal. Right? A judge or tribunal would control the proceedings. You are bound by rules of evidence. But in mediation, given the flexibility of the process, the organic nature of the process, you are not so bound by any formal rules of evidence. You are not subject to the inclination of tribunals and courts. That's the first critical point. The second point is mediation is almost always a without prejudice process. Without prejudice means that whatever that has been disclosed in mediation cannot be used against the other party in a court or in arbitration. Thirdly, it is a confidential and private process. So many of you would have heard about, say, arbitration at the PCA, for example. And I've had a chance to work on several investor-state treaty disputes. Arbitration is not always fully confidential. Invariably, like cases from the PCA, for example, they get reported. Whereas for mediation, it's a confidential and private process, which is important for stakeholder management, right, internally and externally. It is also important to provide a secure environment to have an honest take on the dispute to try to reach a resolution. The other key aspect is this. Now, a mediator doesn't have a lot of powers. A mediator is not a judge or tribunal. It doesn't have the power to direct any disputant parties to do any certain things. It doesn't have the power to make any legal orders, unlike a judge or an arbitral tribunal. But here's the thing. When you place your dispute before an arbitrator or a judge, your dispute becomes binary. It's the only thing that the judge or the arbitrator can decide is who is right or wrong. Are you liable or not? Right? The entire dimension of dispute becomes purely black and white, right? So, and that's because the judge or the tribunal has an obligation to determine a dispute in accordance with the law. Even if it's bad law, for example, sometimes the court or the arbitrator just have no choice. Now, a mediator, is not so restrained. So from a unique perspective, a mediator can be actually more powerful than a judge or an arbitrator, because a mediator has the ability to give effect to the will and autonomy of parties coming to a commercial resolution, something even a judge or a tribunal cannot sanction. Right? And this goes towards my last point, which is that the process allows for parties to turn a dispute into a win-win commercial deal. Right? Because in the mediation process, you are allowed to bring in matters that are legally irrelevant but commercially relevant. Right? So in courts, in the arbitral tribunal, you get a legal resolution, not necessarily a commercial resolution. But in mediation, you have an opportunity to bring in matters that are technically irrelevant to the legal dispute, but might sound attractive to the other party to try to reach a deal. So for example, just to give a simple example, if there's a repossession issue because the airline is facing some financial troubles, the lessor can think of a debt equity swap, for example, right, to take over some control of the airline. If let's say there's a private airport operator having a dispute with a government, where the government decided, one day for ESG or sustainability reasons, not to carry on the project anymore, parties can come together to reach a deal such that, for example, a proposal can be considered to scale down the expansion of the airport, where the government can reach a deal to say, your compensation would come from the revenue streams that's to come, right? There's, let's see how things go first. Depending on the revenue, you can take a cut of it. And in the meantime, why don't we both work together, to promote this as a green airport, this as an ESG airport, to try to raise more buy-in from possible stakeholders. So, conscious of time, I just want to conclude by saying that mediated settlement outcomes are internationally enforceable via the Singapore Convention on Mediation. The USA, China, the United Kingdom, they have all signed up to the convention. There are many jurisdictions who have ratified the convention. So if you have a mediated settlement outcome, you cannot challenge the merits, you cannot reopen the merits of the case, and the local courts of the parties who ratified the convention would enforce the settlement deal, right? Which means going after the assets in the local jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. I guess in the remaining time, I just want to say a little bit of why aviation disputes or disputes between parties in aviation matters, so almost invariably involves financing, leasing, ownership of an aircraft, or the maintenance or the insurance, why they are suitable for mediation over other forms of dispute resolution. As Shaun has mentioned, mediation is private versus something that's public. Mediation seeks to achieve a win-win situation rather than a win-lose situation. And as you know, in aviation industry, whilst it's a huge industry, it's in reality quite a small industry in terms of players. And often, if you are in dispute, at the end of the day, with a manufacturer or with a big funder, your paths with the manufacturer or big funder would still cross, and ability to maintain relations through achieving a win-win situation is important for the long-term relationship of your ownership or financing of the aircraft. So mediation is key as an alternative to sort of disruptive and relationship-ending other forms of dispute resolution, like litigation. There is help in the industry, and that help comes in the form of a specialized association called the Hague Court of Arbitration for Aviation. It says arbitration, but actually it's arbitration and mediation. I sit as co-chair of the mediation committee. In fact, the organization was formed during COVID because obviously the industry for aviation was worst hit by COVID, and we expected that there would be disputes. And the fact that the aviation industry didn't have an alternative dispute resolution association was, being such an old industry, was quite surprising. And Paul Ghibli, who was the chair of the previous committee, was his brainchild, and he gathered a large number of aviation experts together to form this association called the Hague Court of Arbitration for Aviation. They have in their constitution and materials have provided a way forward for anyone with disputes in aviation to use their rules of arbitration and mediation and a large panel of aviation specialists for you to choose from in order to help resolve aircraft-related industry disputes. So you're not alone, and there's an association which can help you. Why are aircraft objects more suitable for alternative dispute resolution rather than courts? Let's look at court processes. Court processes are invariably jurisdiction specific. So you take a court action in a country that you choose, and usually it's the country of the offending party or the country in which the asset is based, typically. Now, that has many unpredictable elements because aircraft objects are an international object, right? Firstly, its state of registration could be one country, its location could be another, the owner could be in a third country, financier could be in a fourth country, and in aircraft objects, it's not always just the owner and the financier. There could be lessors, intermediary charter parties. So many laws could be invoked, and the contract itself could be a different country, mostly English law, but England is a long way from here. So one of the first item that a court will have to unravel is what law applies. And frankly, that's a very difficult question to answer. The rules regarding to conflicts of laws is a specialty area. There's a huge cottage industry of lawyers and books written about it. So you live with an uncertainty as to which law applies, even if you have selected the governing law of your loan or your lease or your OEM contract. Now, you can cut through that by not using the courts, but using both parties' selected mediation process that involves choosing your mediator, choosing your venue, choosing your rules. And that flexibility is very valuable for an aircraft object that has created so much uncertainty law-wise because each country's law is different. And as you fly across each country, the laws that you think you have could be different because, as I said, each country has sovereignty over what laws it wants to apply when your aircraft object lands in it. So we believe that for corporate jets in particular, the best solution is to first consider alternative dispute resolution, and in particular mediation, which can give you a win-win situation over something that is invariably can only have a win-lose situation. I think with that, perhaps we could also take questions from the audience. We have 10 minutes left, so I open questions to the floor. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. We've got a couple of questions on Slido. Does anyone want to ask a question with a microphone? Okay, the first one has, what happens if one party is really angry and wants a day in court and the other one wants to mediate?
I think it's natural to have emotions, right? I think it's how you go about it in a very strategic way. You can be emotional, but that's not mutually exclusive from being strategic about it. So if that makes sense. So I would say this: if you have no choice and you really, really have to have your day in court, regard at the very least the mediation opportunity as an intelligence gathering exercise, because it's one opportunity to hear the other side, and sometimes the things that they don't tell you could be more revealing than what they share. Yes, whatever they share cannot be used formally as evidence, but the angles that you derive from what they share could help shape your court narrative in any event, right? So that's just a tactical take on mediation as a process, and it's not a be-all and end-all. We have seen cases where parties fight out a good fight, in investor treaty arbitration for a good 4 years, only to reach a commercial outcome which could be reached from day one anyway, right? So that's my take on it.
In a way, the anger is like the 4 stages of grief, right? There's always anger if there's a dispute. But with time, people calm down and use their logical minds to try to find a solution. In fact, when you say they want their day in court, most court systems, including the Singapore court system, as part of the court process, requires the parties to attempt mediation. So whether you like it or not, the court views it as important that you try to find a win-win situation and you may be forced into mediation anyways. But as Shaun says, people could use mediation as a fact-finding strategy to gain information that might be useful in litigation. I would say one thing about mediation is that, and people don't know this, is that mediation has a higher than, I'm told, 90% success rate for disputes. 90% success rate. So if you attempt mediation, if you agree to do mediation, there's a 90% chance you'll find a solution between the parties. Amazing. Would you do that rather than go to court?
How long does mediation take compared to litigation?
I think comparatively, it's a much more expedient and less costly process, mediation. Like I said, there are some cases which needs to be litigated for whatever reasons. There are some cases where it's beyond the realms of mediation, but just purely looking at both choices, if you are looking at time and expense, it's a non-starter, right? And like I said earlier on, to turn a dispute into a deal, making exercise means that perhaps the CFO needs to sit down with the GC and the CEO to really look at the matrix, right? It's not just about the loss arising from the dispute. It's balancing that against, what are the benefits, the potential profits that can be derived from a new deal in mediation. I will give a non-aviation example where a US energy company, was suing a South Korean engineering company which decided to scale down and shut down some of its factories in South Korea after a contract. And obviously it's an arbitration, parties take it seriously. But the deal that was reached was quite unique. In exchange for no longer continuing the arbitration, the South Korean company would help the American business partner, the American counterpart, to connect with their resources across Southeast Asia for them to create not just new deals, but create new opportunities, market penetration exercises, new factories across ASEAN, right? So that's, you have shifted from, fighting a good fight in court or in arbitration to looking at, hey, how can we make even more money together, right, across ASEAN? So it's not just about cost savings. Mediation has that unique dimension of, let's quantify what we can derive from the deal as well.
We've got another question. Actually, I'm going to come back to this one. Can we still go for mediation if the agreement provides for arbitration or court dispute resolution. So if the contract had that down, can you still have mediation as an option?
So I think people need to understand that mediation is a consensual approach. So both parties agreeing to go to mediation. So you can always go to mediation, even if your contract says exclusive dispute resolution is by arbitration or litigation, because it's a consensual approach. So yes, you can go to mediation, although we at HCAA encourage a multimodal approach or multi-tiered approach where you try mediation first. If you fail, then you try the more win-lose approaches to dispute resolution.
Great. And you've sort of answered this. Is mediation legally binding?
If there's no settlement outcome, whatever's been said in mediation cannot be used, in arbitration or the court. But if there's a final outcome, if parties have, come to a compromise, and that compromise is recorded by a mediator, that is legally binding, generally speaking. You can bring the settlement agreement to be recorded as a formal court order in the courts, as a consent order. You can bring it before an arbitral tribunal for an arbitral tribunal to issue an award, which would then bring in the New York Convention, where over 150 countries all over the world must respect that award, enforcing that settlement agreement. We also have the Singapore Convention on Mediation, where a mediated settlement agreement can only be challenged on very limited grounds. You can effectively bring that settlement agreement to the relevant jurisdiction, ask the courts of that relevant jurisdiction to give it legal force, and that may sometimes include relevant execution orders, enforcement orders, to give legal effect to the settlement agreement.
So the answer to that is twofold. First, Shaun is correct. There's something called the Singapore Convention and Mediated Settlement Agreement, MSA, if registered, is binding across across the contracting states of Singapore Convention. I can't remember how many countries we have, but it's growing quite quickly. Yeah, very fast. So answer is yes, binding across the Singapore Convention world. The other way, which is a bit of a hack, is to, if you're close to a mediation agreement, settled agreement between the parties, you could avail yourself of the New York Convention, which is the results of an arbitration. And the New York Convention is ratified across over 100 countries, binding in 100 countries. So you basically have an arbitration, you pause it to get your mediated settlement agreement. Once you get that, you bring that back into the arbitration process, confirmed by the arbitrator, and then you have an arbitration award that is binding across the New York Convention world, which is over 100 countries. So I guess overall it is binding if you do it properly, with properly advised lawyers, obviously. Thanks.
Final question, unless we have one from the audience. Does most of it happen, when we talk about the mediation and arbitration, is most of that happening online now? Is it by Zoom, or is it better to have people sitting in a room?
Again, mediation is a consensual.
But is it happening on Zoom?
Okay, so
nowadays, or do you actually have to get everyone? Is it better to have everyone in the room?
It's just like the argument as to can you fax a handshake, or it's difficult over Zoom to be able to assess body language and certain unseen or unsensed vibes through electronic means. So I think the preference is still face-to-face, but Zoom is and other forms of telecommunication is becoming more acceptable by parties, even for cross-examination of witnesses, which in the past people said absolutely no way. Cross-examination has to be live and not over Zoom, but people are doing it that now. So yes, the answer is, I think the preference is face-to-face, but we are seeing more and more mediation through Zoom. I don't know what John thinks.
I think the human touch is critical in the mediation process because just speaking across the table, negotiating across the table, from a tactical point of view, you want to get a real sense of, who's on the other side. But from a genuine good faith, goodwill point of view, I think it's just different from speaking to a computer screen. So different. Given that there are two big things happening in Singapore over the weekend, Formula One and the Mooncake Festival, I would say this, right? In the American-Korean dispute, when the American friends brought in mooncakes, that changed the entire dimension of the conversation. Like, you're coming from a perspective of cultural respect and saying, you know what, let's just have a genuine opportunity to talk, as persons. It's irreplaceable from the perspective of Zoom.
Did you charge them for telling them to bring mooncakes? Thanks very much. We've coffee from Tag Aviation is outside. Thank you.